In today's video, we are going to talk about the difference between the proxy, reverse proxy, load balancer, API gateway, and the service mesh. Let's take a very simple example. Let's take modern systems. In our modern systems, what is the traffic flow? Traffic flow is usually, let's say, that starts with the client. In our case, let's take the example of the client as a server. So what happens is that let's take an example of a client as a browser. So what happens is that so we are making a request from the request starts from the client, from a browser. Browser sends a request, and that request is usually not directly goes to the internet. First, we are sending that request to the forward proxy or just proxy, right? It hides the client's IP. So basically, the forward proxy or proxy is there in order to protect the user, right? Protect the client. So when the client makes the request, that request not directly goes to the internet. It first goes to the forward proxy. It hides the client IP, and then that forward proxy makes the request to the internet. So after that, that request goes to the the request goes further. So the next one is that we have a reverse proxy. What's the reverse proxy? Reverse proxy is it's as the name suggests, right? It's reverse, meaning that it protects not the client, but in this case it hides the servers, right? It protects the servers because client doesn't need to know that the exact address of the each servers. So that's why the requests are from the client first goes to the forward proxy, and then it goes to the reverse proxy, which hides the servers. And then after that, what happens? The request goes to the load balancer. What's the load balancer? Let's say that we have 3 microservices here, right? So let's say that we have here 3 microservices. First one, second one, and the third one. And each microservice is scaled. So we have the replicas of the microservices. And we need to, when the request comes to the load balancer, we need to distribute that load between the microservices, right? First one, for example, should go to this copy, second one should go to this copy, and third one go to this copy. There are different algorithms that we are using in load balancer in order to route the traffic. The goal of the purpose of the load balancer, as the name suggests, is just to distribute the traffic between our microservices. The next one is that the API gateway. What is the purpose of the API gateway? The API gateway in this case, let's say we have 3 microservices in this case, but let's say we have more. We have 10, we have 15. So when we receive a request, we don't, from the request side, we don't need the load balancer, right? It doesn't need to know that each microservice, it doesn't need to know to which microservice sent the request. So for that, we have a single entry point. So we have API gateway to all our applications. These requests actually, they don't go to the microservices directly, they go to the API gateway. From the API gateway, we know that to which microservice exactly wrote this request. For example, we are routing to this microservice. Let me change the color. So we are routing that to this microservice, or the next one to this microservice, or to another microservice, and so on. So basically, API gateway is an entry point to our system. And the last one is the service mesh. So what's the service mesh? So let's say in this case we have 3 microservices, but again we may have more. And besides making a request, besides the routing the incoming request to the microservices, what also we do is our microservices talking with each other. So for example, this microservice send the request to this microservice to get some data, or this microservice send the request to this microservice to get data, and so on, right? So the communication between the services, internally between the microservices, is managed by the service mesh. So what service mesh does? Service mesh does several things. The most important one is the authentication. So it authenticates each microservice. So let's say that we are making a request from the first microservice to second microservice. It authenticates that request. It also manages the logging and all other all other things that we need to. If we don't have the service mesh, so what we're going to do, we will need to add, we will force to add actually to each microservice authentication, logging, and so on. So in order to avoid that, what we do, we are using a already existing tool. So for example, we are using Istio here. So we are using Istio and or similar tools in order to outsource that work of the authentication and the logging and so on to another tool. So to sum up our traffic, right? So our traffic. So what happens to our traffic is, first we have a forward proxy. It's basically for outbound request that comes from the client. That request goes to, after we receive that request, first we have a reverse proxy in order to hide our internal services. Then we have a load balancer in order to send the request to the, so in order to send request to the different microservices. Let's say that we have 5 instances, we need to send them to the different instances of our microservice. So the next one is the API gateway. It's basically one entry endpoint to our services. And the last one is that the service mesh. Service mesh is used, it's for internal. So this one is outbound, right? So forward proxy is outbound, which means that the request coming from the client. Reverse proxy, load balancer, API gateway when we receive the request and we are processing that. And the service mesh is used for the interaction between the microservices. So to sum up, what are the tools we have, right? So forward proxy, what it does. Forward proxy hides the client and the filters, and also it does some caching. So there are tools that we can use for it. For the reverse proxy, what it does, right? Reverse proxy, it shields the backend, so it hides the internal servers, and it also uses the caching. And the tools that we use for it, the most widely used is Nginx. And also for the load balancer, we are using it's used for distributing the loads. And for example, the tools that we have is AWS load balancer and similar. And for the API gateway, it's a single entry point for the microservices. We are using Kong. And for the service mesh, it's used for the observability. For the security, we are using Istio and the similar tools. Again, in reality, what happens is that, for example, let's say that the Nginx, it plays the role of the reverse proxy. It plays also the role of the load balancer. In reality, we don't have the separate load balancer in real projects, right? In real world. So we don't have that. We don't have all of them as a separate tool. So most of the tools that we are using, they are combining the functionalities of the several tools that we have discussed here. So what happens is, let's say that the one real world flow. So in one flow, so user sends from the browser, user sends a request. That request goes to the forward proxy. It's let's say corporate filter, and after that it goes to the internet. From the internet it goes to the reverse proxy or load balancer. Again, as you can see here, we have an Nginx which is used for both, right? For reverse proxy and for the load balancer. For the API gateway, we are using Kong, and for the microservices, we are using Istio for the service mesh side, right? Which means that for the interaction for microservices, for interacting with each other, we are using the Istio. And to sum up what we have learned today, right? So forward is basically, forward proxy is that it controls the outbound, reverse proxy and the load balancer, it manages the inbound, API gateway, it's basically for the routing the request and for the policies, and the service mesh is for the internal communication.